Hi, and welcome back to the third of 6 TPI webinars on spectrum policy. Today, we're discussing commercial space and spectrum access. I'm Sarah Olam, Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute, and joining us today, we have Peter Davidson, Vice President of Global Government Affairs and Policy at Intelsat, David Goldman, Vice President of Satellite Policy at SpaceX, Kalpit Goody, Head of Regulatory Affairs at Project Kuiper at Amazon, Svetlana Matt, Director of Public Policy at EchoStar, and Henry Wendel, Special Counsel at Cooley, LLP. There's been a lot of exciting news about satellite-to-Earth services lately, like Starlink and T-Mobile's text-to-cellular announcement earlier in February. Yesterday, AST Space Mobile and AT&T announced its satellite-to-cellular service with its Bluebird satellites. We also heard about Apple's additional $1.7 billion investment in Globalstar last November for additional satellite capacity. So my first question for the panel here, could each of you share what you think are the most important satellite spectrum policy priorities for this coming year? The supplemental coverage from Space Order recently enabled more spectrum leasing. In January, additional spectrum was allocated to the 2 gigahertz band for commercial space launches. And Chairman Brendan Carr hasn't included space items yet in his blog posts, but I'm sure there are a lot up for consideration. We have a new Space Bureau chief, Jay Schwartz. So there's a lot happening. So maybe just to do a quick lightning round to hear from each of you, your thoughts about what's really important to focus on this year. So we can just go in any order if anyone wants to start. Maybe Peter, do you want to start us off?
Okay, I guess I'll go first if I have to. Yeah. No, listen, Sarah, thanks for having us here. This is terrific. I just want to start by saying what an exciting time it is to be working in the space. I spent a good portion of my career on Earth in terrestrial communications and transitioned at just about the right time. So really exciting to see what's going on. As you mentioned in the introduction, there are new services and technologies being rolled out every day at Intelsat. We actually just came from an all-hands meeting. I got a delicious, this is the most incredibly wonderful Pop-Tart you've ever seen. We distributed these. And we were going through a number of our new technologies that we're rolling out over the next year or so with a number of different partnerships. So what we're really focused on right now is our multi-orbit strategy. We have partnerships with Starlink. We have partnerships with OneWeb in the LEO orbit. As you may know, we are combining with SES. We are in the process of completing that deal in the next couple months, which will result in a very robust GEO constellation, as well as a MEO constellation. So we think that some of the technologies that are emerging now will be very well served by a multi-orbit strategy, since different orbits provide different pros and cons for consumers around the world. So very exciting to look at the direct-to-device innovations that are going on right now. I think that is going to bring, I really think that, that's a killer app for US and worldwide consumers. I think, it's going to be much more impactful than the transition to 5G was. And will expose a lot of customers around the world to what space providers can do. So just very optimistic and excited about the future of space communications.
Great. Anyone want to go next? Kalpit, maybe?
Sure. Again, I think this is a great topic. As David mentioned, this is one of the most exciting times, or the most exciting time in space for space systems, space communications that we've ever seen. I think it's the most exciting time in space since the Apollo program, with the level of interest and the capabilities and the technologies coming to bear. I think when it comes to spectrum, the real word of the day is sharing, is how do we better utilize spectrum more efficiently across more operators? I think that really is fundamental to the future success of space. I think just very quickly, and to touch on it at a high level, I'll talk about it more, I'm sure, later. I think three broad areas of interest and that I think are fundamental is one, the EPFD rules. This is the rules of how spectrum is shared between NGSO providers and geo providers. I think it's really fundamental. I was involved many years ago, more than I care to admit, in the creation of those rules. Those rules were created at a time when the technology was very different. And it was also created at a time, I remember because I was in a geo operator at the time, we created rules really to make it very difficult for NGSOs to be up and operational. Today's technology is dramatically different. And I think the opportunity to share and to enable much greater and more efficient utilization of that spectrum by NGSOs is absolutely is out there in front of us, and it would create tremendous opportunities, more opportunities across the world for more operators and more efficient use for those who are out there. Second is the UMFUS rules. These are the rules in the US for Ka-band and V-band in particular about how satellites share certain spectrum with terrestrial mobile. When these rules were sold at the FCC, the idea was this was going to be nationwide coverage, 5G spectrum for the mobile carriers. It really hasn't panned out in that way. I think what has come to bear is that this spectrum, given its propagation characteristics, the high cost of deployment, is really at best a densification spectrum in urban areas. The rules right now do not match that kind of utilization and really lead to a lot of wasted spectrum, additional costs for everyone else. So I think modernization of those rules is really important and fundamental. And last, I'll just mention the direct-to-cell proceeding. I think those opportunities are significant. I think creating additional spectrum, additional opportunities for more providers to be in, I think is also very fundamental. The opportunities to serve customers in a new and efficient way, to provide connectivity to where we haven't had it, I think can really be a significant game changer.
Does anyone want to go next? Henry?
Well, I'll jump in and kind of talk about a different piece of the commercial space sector, which is the ISAM group, right? In-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturers who are growing at an exponential rate. And there's a lot of investment from the private markets into that group, as well as, DoD contracts to help support their missions. Right now there's no dedicated spectrum to ISAM operations, and it's clear that that's going to be something that needs to change. And as Calpac was talking about, while there's familiarity and sharing in the space sector between operators, the sharing is also going to have to be with our federal partners who have consistently used that spectrum for good purposes. But it seems to us that we can also share between commercial and the DoD. So, I'm hopeful that this administration will prioritize finding spectrum and supporting ISAM operations, because it's going to be critical to for the operators. At one point, satellites were sent into space, and it was just going to be something that was never touched again. But ISAM provides a lot of opportunities for us to either recharge, reboost, whatever it may be, those satellites, and being able to do that will help sustainability and a number of other areas.
I guess I can jump in next. A lot of it, I'm going to be boring. I'm going to echo a lot of what everybody has been saying. I'm sorry. But one of the things that occurs to me every time I see a panel like this is when you think about space, the players that you're seeing here are the kind of the ones that come to top of mind. But what really is happening in the US right now is burgeoning space industry of companies that you don't think of. There's a lot of small businesses. On our launch side, we do these rideshare launches where we can launch hundreds of satellites from smaller companies doing all kinds of new innovative things. And there's all kinds of new opportunity. Access to space, it's never been more available. And we're really seeing a lot of entrepreneurs, innovators come up with new ideas. And I think one of the challenges going forward is to make sure that our policies match what's needed for kind of this new US space industry, which is unlike anything that we've seen before. One of the things that I've been encouraged by is that Chairman Carr has talked repeatedly about trying to lower the regulatory barriers to entry, trying to speed decisions. I think that's going to be necessary. Under Chair Rosenworcel, they created the Space Bureau. They've done a lot of work starting to laying the groundwork for things that are going to be coming. I think there's still a lot of new steps that can be taken. We still really need to take the big leap from command and control type licensing to more flexible type licensing. We had learned a ton, and I'm sure Peter can tell us all about, from his experience on the wireless side, how important it is to have flexibility in the licensing side and how that pushed the US ahead of the world by switching our licensing to that kind of framework. And you can't do it exactly the same way in satellite, but I do think there's opportunities to think about ways, are there lessons that we can learn from our successes on the terrestrial side and bring that into space with this kind of new space industry that we have coming? Some of that can be in shot clocks, kind of putting out, here's your expectation of how long it should take once you apply for a license to how long it will take till you get it. In the past, it's taken years. That's just not the world we live in anymore. It's companies need to invest. They need to be able to have some sort of predictability. And what that can do also is when you have these shot clocks on your decisions, it focuses the mind on what's most important. We can also bring in, CalPAC made some really important points about the KA and V band licensing. I think we should realize that when we're looking at a world of 6G coming up, that's going to be ubiquity. That's going to be heterogeneous networks. That's going to have satellite and terrestrial working together. And what we need to do is how do we make sure that the licensing frameworks and the regulations match up with what's coming? And some of that is reforming these rules that were set years ago, is not how the world has turned out, hasn't anticipated the technology. And are there things like light licensing, in the E band, so it's like 70, 80 gigahertz, we have a light licensing framework that's kind of a database registration type licensing that makes life just go much easier and you can license much faster. It recognizes the actual characteristics of the physics of the frequencies. I think we can start looking at things like that. Is that available in other bands? Can that help speed up approvals? Can it give more predictability? Similarly, traditionally, when the satellites were licensed, it's all licensed by condition, which means when you apply for a license, you don't actually know what you're going to be authorized for until you get your license. And a lot of times that license doesn't come until right before you're about to launch. So you're building an entire system, not actually knowing what the regulations are for your system. Can we switch that to more of a license by rule and having actual set regulations in advance and minimizing the amount of conditions that you put on a license and have it more predictable and consistent across operators? So that's on the procedural side. Just hit quickly on a couple of kind of spectrum policy issues. As CalPAC mentioned, EPFD, that changes everything. That will get more people online in the United States, around the world. You can do it without really having major effects to the existing satellite operators. It's just a knob you can turn up and get more people online with better broadband. And something we've been looking at a lot is across the mobile satellite spectrum bands. There's a lot of opportunity there to look at new ways to share those bands. I think I think, yeah, as you look across them, there's a lot of, I guess, with the new technologies and the new space systems that are being put up, there's opportunities to use this existing satellite, mobile satellite spectrum to allow more sharing and allow more competition and bring new services to consumers. So those are the ones that we're really going to be looking at for the next year.
And I guess I'll go to round things out. Well, thank you so much for having me here. Really looking forward to being part of this conversation. As others have noted, it's a very exciting time for the industry, and it's also a really exciting time for EchoStar. Just to level set and take a step back, a little over a year ago, EchoStar, which is the parent company of Hughes Satellite, which is our satellite broadband business, recombined with its sister company Dish. And so now we're all EchoStar now, and we're really excited that we have the satellite expertise of many years, but at the same time, we're a recently new entrant on the Dish side in the wireless space. And we've built out the world's first and largest standalone 5G Open RAN network. And so looking at, both of our expertise in both areas and the many developments happening right now in the industry, we're really excited about the opportunity to leverage both as the many innovations are taking place in this area. In terms of key policy priorities for this year, we think that policies that promote competition are really, really critical and is something that should be a focus area. We think that models that promote, policies that promote partnership and collaboration are really critical. And while also protecting the potential harmful interference of users that are in the various bands. The SCS order from last year sought to promote partnership and collaboration while also balancing, the needs to protect from harmful interference for existing users. And we think that those policy goals are really important as part of the larger efforts to promote competition in this area. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. So now that we have, a lot of different touch points to discuss, what is your all view about these, hybrid approaches? So there are a lot of joint ventures, there are a lot of combinations. So you see GSO and GSO combinations, satellite, terrestrial. How does that happen in light of a backdrop of regulation? Can there be more private collaborations and sharing agreements, like coordination at borders, or how much does the FCC get in the way? Or are there places where your companies want to do something together, but the rules are just rigid?
And start, I guess, Sarah, and just say that I think, regulators, when you're talking about these hybrid services are being offered, I think they're kind of scrambling a little bit around the world to figure out how to manage this. I think, Calpac and David talked about, the need for speed, licensing, approvals, new technologies, and we're totally embrace that as well. But I think regulators are looking at, okay, well, we want to be, and not all regulators, but I think, kind of forward-looking regulators are saying, listen, we like innovation, we like investment. We want to have a regulatory regime that's going to encourage this experimentation, and that will benefit consumers. At the same time, we need to make sure that we aren't interfering with existing services, and that there are some, they can't be completely the Wild West, that there are some regulations that actually make, the investment environment, the space environment livable for the long run. So that kind of, you talk about, spectrum. I mean, everyone that spoke on this panel so far talked a little bit about spectrum, a little bit about space sustainability, a little bit about, procedural licensing and things like that, because they're all kind of mashed together. So I think finding that sweet spot will allowing, this initial phase of experimentation to kind of see what's going to rise to the top, where's the consumer benefit going to be, and then figuring out what's the long-term regulatory regime that's going to manage some of these in a sustainable way.
I guess like one way to do that, David raised, is flexibility in spectrum licenses. Have you all thought about what it would look like to have more flexible spectrum licenses? I mean, the supplemental coverage from space is kind of an example of that, allowing spectrum to be used for different purposes, like the mobile spectrum for satellite or vice versa. But then you hit upon, the other dimensions like power levels or how is flexibility in satellite spectrum different from terrestrial, or, can we have a little bit of education for all the terrestrial spectrum folks? How is satellite different here?
I can jump in here quickly. The satellite spectrum typically is shared spectrum, unlike mobile spectrum, which is licensed dedicated. You worry about the border issue in terms of out of band or at an adjacent border that you don't have licenses for. Sharing is a little different. So you have to create rules that enable that, clear, defined rules. I think the commission did a great job last year in the NGSO sharing item, which was supported, had a unanimous vote in support of it, of creating those types of clear rules that enable sharing, encourage much more dynamic utilization of that spectrum. Don't have the rules stand in the way of new entrants coming in. So setting the bar for permissible interference at an acceptable level that enables both sides to work together and to exist and to compete. I think those types of approaches, are essential in the satellite world in terms of spectrum sharing.
I feel like I'm making the panel boring if I'm supposed to fight with CalPAC. So, everything he said is wrong, but it's all correct. And the spectrum sharing proceeding actually last year is just a great example of it. Is the commission came out, set the power levels, and the other thing that it did that was really interesting, and is something that it really should be looking at other places to take this on, is it does set protections for incumbent systems, earlier round systems, but to encourage innovation and new entrants, it sunsets those protections over time. And this is a really interesting, innovative idea. It doesn't sound like it should be, but it really is, especially in this space of, realizing that at some point, the older technologies need to compete with the new entrants as well. And you can't, if you just put a wall up and say, whatever we set 20 years ago, 30 years ago, continues to be the protections for now and all time, you're stifling innovation, you're stopping competition, and ultimately the consumers are the ones that are getting hurt. And so what they did in the spectrum sharing proceeding that's really an interesting model is you set the protection levels, you say to earlier systems that have filed earlier, that applied earlier, here's the protection levels that you get for a set amount of time. But then at some point, you have to realize that there's going to be new entrants there and that you're going to have to compete on equal footing. And you can't just kind of use your earlier status to kind of box out competition forever. I think we should be looking for other places where we can do that, frankly. That's not always going to be great for SpaceX, to be totally honest, because we are out ahead on some of these things. We are doing things, but we have to realize that you can't use that status to then start blocking out forever going ahead. So we should explore that. I think CalPAC makes a really good point on that. The other kind of circling back on another part of your question about how do you encourage partnerships and working together, the kind of direct-to-device SCS model that you're referring to is also it's like an innovative, interesting idea. It's how we've been handling going direct-to-device, is that we do partner. What the FCC is looking at is when you say, actually, in some ways they're saying when you have flexible licenses terrestrially, is it so flexible that you can actually use different kinds of technology? Traditionally, no. Traditionally, flexible licenses wasn't flexible enough for any of us to use for satellites, but going forward, that they are looking at it. They are looking for ways to be able to do that. It's a really interesting idea. I think it's paying dividends. We've now turned on our service. I think others are coming quickly, as you were mentioning. I think this is the future, right? Like there's only so much spectrum. We have to be looking at ways that we can all work together. And I think having regulations that not only don't stop that from happening, but actually encourage it from happening, can only lead to kind of more opportunities going forward.
Derek, can I respond to those two guys for just a little bit? I don't disagree with anything that Calpac and David said. I think it's more a question of making sure that you have the big picture. So part of what, if you look at, so why the United States has done so well in terms of investment in our wireless networks, our terrestrial wireless networks, is because there's a certain amount of certainty that we have in the licenses that are purchased and the regulatory regime, so that you can commit billions of dollars of capital that takes a lot of time to play out. And you wouldn't get that if you didn't have the certainty. And I think many regulatory regimes overseas don't have that kind of commitment and the certainty that you need to put that kind of money into the space. The same is true in space. Many of our satellites, especially in the GEO orbit, cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build. Some of those are getting smaller, less expensive. In LEO and MEO, you have smaller, but oftentimes even greater investment to create a constellation. We look now at, we have Kuiper coming online shortly. We have Starlink expanding. We have the Europeans looking at their constellation. We have the Chinese looking at 3 constellations. And then, several others that are in the licensing processes around the world. So all I'm saying, I guess, is we need a balance between having some certainty that the investment money you're putting in is not going to go away due to regulatory changes or interference level changes. At the same time, it is beneficial to have new entrants, and we partner with a whole bunch of new entrants. Henry mentioned before the ISAMs. We were the first ones to do the mission extension vehicles for our satellites. So we're adding, 5+ years of sustainable use for our satellites in GEO. And we have a number of partnerships going on right now that are going to be less expensive, more flexible ways to extend our satellites. So again, it's a balance between kind of having the flexibility in your regulatory and your spectrum policies, at the same time having some consistency in application. And I think David was kind of getting at this as well with the compromise that was struck, so that you allow new entrants to come in and create new innovation. So it's the balance that they're going to have to strike.
And I guess I would just reiterate the point that I made earlier, which I think is in line with what others have said as well, to some extent, is just the critical importance of really urging, designing policies in a way that truly promote partnerships and collaboration in the space. There are a lot of really exciting new entrants. There are also users in the existing band, and so I think just having this critical goal of trying to figure out the regulatory landscape in a way that balances the two is key.
And I'll just chime in real quick to say that we've talked a lot about the regulatory process, and I think everybody's spot on. And Peter mentioned the transaction that Intelsat's involved with SES. I think I'm expecting to see more transactions. The cost of investment in space is really, really high. The risk is also really high. And, as the commission's getting more and more transactions before it, I'm hopeful that the staff there will be quick to review and process those applications, because those partnerships, are going to be critical, whether it's a combination like Intelsat and SES or some other plan that companies form. They're doing the best they can to build out their networks or their operations, and having a commission that's promoting these types of business partnerships is going to be really important for the industry at whole.
I just want to just jump into, maybe add a little bit to Peter's point here. I think there's a little bit of a tension here in terms of, there's always the tension of protecting incumbent rights, incumbent services versus innovation and competition. And I think what the satellite industry, and I've been in the satellite industry for far too long, the industry and the rules set up were really set up to extend longevity. I get priority, I sit on that priority, I protect that priority with my life. and I extend the utilization of my space asset as long as possible. What did that create? It created a real vibrant geo industry for a long period of time. But that's not the world we live in today. The world we live in today is one of innovation, of constant change. We have to keep updating and improving our networks. The mobile industry got that from very early on. They were innovating on a 5 to 7 year life cycle. The satellite industry needs to do that, and that's exactly what's being done in the NGSO or LEO space. I would say geos need to adjust to that new reality, and they will. They're going to do a phenomenal job of adjusting to that as well. But the rules have to enable that. The protection of priority for long-term rights to spectrum. By the way, spectrum you didn't pay for, makes it kind of a detriment to that level of innovation. And so I think what the commission has been looking at more recently, and the world is looking at, is how do you create that incentive structure to go drive innovation, new networks, building on from Gen 1 to Gen 2 to Gen 3 and encouraging that.
Great. And going back to the
just one other element that Calpac was kind of mentioning there too, and I think again, first of all, there's a lot of innovation that goes on in geo, Calpac. I know you didn't intend to say that there wasn't innovation there, because we're doing lots of cool stuff there. But part of what I think, and I don't disagree with flexibility, with being quicker, with being more efficient in licensing and looking at things. But there is an issue of, in particular in the LEO orbit, where you're going to have this incredible expansion of activity in the next, 5 to 7 years. At least 5 new constellations coming into play in LEO. And someone's got to get their arms around, and regulators have to figure out, how do you encourage the development of that space and all the benefits that come with the investment that's happening there, without having adverse consequences, whether it's interference or collision risk or space junk or whatever it is. That's where all these things kind of come together too. So spectrum and space sustainability kind of meet at that point. And it's very hard, and we've, Calpac and David and I and others have had multiple meetings and trade associations and other places about kind of how do we find that happy medium where we can allow that to happen. At the same time, we understand the scope of what's going on in the LEO market, and whether it's interference or the other issues we're talking about. What is that going to look like 5 years from now? And we don't want to wake up, 5 years from now and say nothing works in LEO anymore because of, the amount of services that are being provided there. So I think there's a happy medium between what David and Calpac are talking about, and I think what a lot of regulators in the US and around the world are kind of wrapping their minds around right now.
Yeah, and I think just kind of circling back on the point that I think Calpac made initially, is that the FCC actually mapped the course for how to handle this last year when it did the NGSO rules. Because what it did is it set protections. NGSO systems are also extremely expensive to deploy. And so what they did is they set protections that last for a certain amount of time. And then at some point, you've recouped your investment on that. And you don't have to throw them away, but your first mover advantage at some point starts going away. That starts meaning that you have to encourage new entrants and innovation. And by doing that, you sunset the protections over time. So what the FCC did for NGSOs is they balanced the two. They say you get protections for a certain amount of time, and then that goes away. And then it becomes that everybody competes on even footing. And it doesn't say that the first movers then lose out. They're not no longer allowed to provide service, but any kind of spectrum advantage that they got, regulatory advantage that they got, at some point that has to even out. So I think, to me, it seems like the FCC has already showed us the compromise. And I think it's working out well.
Yeah, So to go back to the FCC's process and how they're looking at these new ideas, I think maybe David, you mentioned that they're licensing with conditions versus setting clear rules, which would be preferable. Is that just a feature of the licensing system? Because there are some dockets where the rules are decided and debated in comments, but why is it that in satellite licensing there can be conditions placed? Is that, is it just tradition, or is it a feature of satellite, or what? Are there some process improvements that can happen?
I mean, from my perspective, yeah. So I think it is true. Some of this is historical and it's been the way that it's done. Some of it is because, I mean, it is different than terrestrial in that we don't have exclusive licenses. It is shared. And so there's an amount that that regulators in the US and around the world need to be able to look at. Are the sharing rules working? Are what you're proposing is, are you going to be increasing interference to anybody else? You shouldn't be doing that. And that's fair. But you can give more predictability to that. And I think traditionally the way that it's worked, and yeah, I think for geo, kind of historically it's been okay, but we're getting to a different world where it doesn't scale is really the problem. Is the historical way that you do it, it's a lot of disclosure requirements, and then the FCC will then look at what you've disclosed and kind of determine what they think is in the public interest based off of your filing. But I think we're getting to a world where that's not feasible. A lot of the backlog we're seeing is because the FCC is getting more and more applications, and it's not going to be feasible both from a regulatory perspective, but also for the industry that every application is a snowflake. Every application gets its own bespoke set of rules that's different than its competitors, and it's different from you don't know which ones they are in advance. I think we have to start converting this into being more predictable. Instead of just having disclosure requirements, is what are the rules? What are the interference levels that we have to build to? Let us, those of us that are on this call who are not the engineers, let us go back to our engineers and say, hey, here's what the rules are. This is what you have to build to. This is what you have to build around. Right now, I'm assuming everybody on this panel has kind of similar experiences, that our engineers will ask us, so, what do we have to do here to make sure that we're authorized? And I often am saying, I'm not quite sure. We'll have to wait and see what the license says. That's just not going to be a scalable model going forward. And so I think we have to start converting that into more of a set of, here's the things you have to do. Here's the limits. They can be hard limits. I mean, they can be hard restrictions. But tell us what they are so we can build towards it and so we can innovate.
I think part of the problem for the commission has been the industry is moving so rapidly that the ability of their regulations to keep pace has not been there. So they have gone the process of condition by condition, application by application, to what David is saying is exactly right. Every operator seems to be operating under a different set of rules, and that's problematic. The commission has the best intentions at heart, but that has been challenging, I think, for the industry to manage that. Also, reporting requirements. Reporting requirements have been assessed almost at random and almost as if they're free. They're not free. There are costs associated with all of those in multiple ways. So I think creating some consistency, I think, is important. I think David's point of clear rules, I think, allow everyone to move faster together. Right now, we've been operating without those kind of clear rules. And again, getting back to the NGSO sharing item, not to beat that beat that drum too loudly. I think that was a really massive and important step forward to creating a certain set of common, well understood rules for how operators can work. I think they may be required in some other areas, and create those rules and let industry compete and move forward with clarity.
There another area, maybe not to divert the conversation, but that where the space is different than terrestrial, is international coordination. And so, you have these very long-term, your World Radio Conference meetings that happen every 4 years. And I don't know which agenda we're on right now. I think it's like 8 years from now or so. It just takes, it takes a long time. So that process internationally is an interesting process, very, very different from what we have. And I think we can only do so much from the United States, but I'd say a couple things. Number one, it's very important that the United States continue to stay very engaged in those international institutions, whether it be, at the ITU or the WRC meetings or some of the other ones that happen with space sustainability issues and things like that. So if the United States is going to have, the kind of investment incentive regimes that David and CalPAC are talking about, we have to be there helping to set the rules, whether that be standards or whether it be, harmonization of spectrum or whatever it is, because there are adversary governments that are going to fill the gap if the United States isn't there. So that's point number one. And then secondly, I do think that, we can look in the United States at the FCC has made some good changes. Congress was looking at legislation in the last Congress to kind of do some bigger picture changes. And interestingly, when that legislation was moving, the FCC took some of those suggestions from the legislation and implemented those. David talked about creation of the Space Bureau. So I think there's some things that on the legislative side that Congress can look at. And then taking my Intelsat hat off, this is a thought I've had for a number of years. I think the Commerce Department should look at elevating the Office of Space Commerce to a bureau. And it's now got funding. When I was at the Commerce Department, we had 3 people in the office. We moved it to the Office of the Secretary and tried to make it more prominent, but we didn't have funding to do a lot of what they can do now. So Rich did a good job there in sort of standing up some of the metrics that they're looking at. And if you take it to another level, I think they can serve the same function that like the ITA does for trade at Commerce, and that is provide kind of bigger picture policy, provide some cheerleading for U.S. space industry, and help set some of that broader environment. The FCC Space Bureau is terrific, and the FCC is awesome in terms of what they're doing with space, but they are regulators as well. So there's kind of a function that different functions you could have. So anyway, I just throw that on the table as a thought from my personal perspective.
I would echo the point about the ITU. I think having the ITU plays a really important role in having a robust global space economy, and the U.S.'s participation is a key part of that. So it's critical that the U.S. remains very engaged in the ITU and as a leader. And, to the point that in terms of streamlining processes and approvals, that is something that we also see as important. So processes that can be created for that would also be beneficial.
And what everybody's been talking about is creating real issues today. The lack of cohesion among federal agencies on policies and procedures is making it very difficult for the startups that David mentioned to grow and to evolve in the US. I have several clients that are just frustrated with the process that we've all been hearing about today, and they're just going to other countries because it's a lot easier, it's a lot faster, and most importantly, there's certainty, right? Like these startups that are on their very first funding round can't say to their engineers, hey, in 2 years, I'll get you the information on what we're going to have in our license, right? They need certainty so that they know what to build and how to build it and where it's going to go and when it's going to go. And so, Australia has a far more flexible regime in many instances. Countries within Europe are developing processes and procedures that are far more flexible and certain. And so if we do want the US to lead this commercial space economy on the launch side, on the communication side, on the ISAM sectors. It's really important for the entirety of the federal government to get together on one page and to take steps to promote the growth, not just to regulate it, because the regulations are going to force these companies to go offshore, whether it's to friendly nations or adversarial ones. It doesn't really matter. Our priority should be keeping them in the US so that they can continue to partner with the SpaceXs and the Kuipers and the Intelsats and the EchoStars of the world, right? We want them to be here and growing and providing jobs and growth to our economy.
That's really interesting. So what about Australia's regime, that is different than the US? Like, is the US, is it a relic of just the way things are built, or is it, is it that simple that,
Yes,
the US system could be easier? Why are these startups going to Australia?
because it's fast and easy and cheap. Like my clients can get a license in 2 weeks. It's just that easy. And, when versus years or months or whatever it may be.
But are there downsides to that? Like, is there a reason why the US is, more careful, or there are bigger incumbents here? Or
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, it's got to be a balance, I think. And I don't disagree with what Henry said. I think we got a lot of work to do here in the United States, and we get very frustrated as well with the time it takes to do things and we need to do. On the other hand, you can't have kind of an international race to the bottom on regulatory approvals either, because then they'll just, they'll authorize 300,000 300,000 satellite constellation with no protections on interference or whatever it is, and they'll do it for you in 2 weeks. And that's not, because that's not great, because then everybody around the world can do that. I think the United States has to be a leader in finding the balance again between innovation and investment and getting new startups up and going, at the same time kind of an efficient but effective regulatory regime that's looking at all of the elements that go into it. So I don't know.
So on a couple points on that. So first, like, one model that I keep thinking about for how these regulations can work is that states in the US compete with which states are going to be best to incorporate in. And I actually don't think that that's turned into a race to the bottom. What it's turned into is that states that make the processes easier and more predictable are then able to exert more control and more guardrails on how things operate, because the companies want to go to where it's easy. And by doing that, then it puts certain states in the driver's seat on controlling how are things going to move forward. And we see states that are actually competing to be the states with the most streamlined, with the most straightforward processes. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily no holds barred and it all goes into a cage match from there. It actually can have regulations, can have oversight, but the process doesn't have to be so painful to get there. But I also just wanted to also underscore a point that Peter was making about the ITU and US engagement there. I think what we saw at the last World Radio Conference in 23 is that a lot of the world was realizing that the US was pulling ahead in space. And we saw a very, very anti-US sentiment at the last World Radio Conference. And it wasn't subtle. It was in every session, every agenda item. It came up over and over again. People, other parts of the world were concerned that the US was getting ahead, and they were trying to pull that back. Going into the next World Radio Conference and the steps along the way, we really need the US to be really involved. They need to be a source for good. They need to be a source for having smart regulations. And I think that the US could do more. I 100% agree with Henry that, like, we can be doing more within the US delegation to make the US delegation process work better, to make sure that the US positions are stronger. But another thing we really need to watch out for, an increasing number of these international meetings are happening in countries that are sanctioned, or that US government officials aren't allowed to travel to, or have limited travel to, or can't bring their technology to. That is really, really going to hamstring the United States and its ability to kind of push for good rules and push back on this anti-US sentiment. I I think we all need to be a little bit more conscious of how this is setting up and looking at where these meetings are and whether or not the U.S. government officials are actually going to be able to show up at the level that they need to be, and with the tools that they need to make sure that we're getting the kind of policies that are going to encourage innovation going forward.
And that's a multi-agency. I mean, there are 3 or 4 government agencies that participate in these conferences, and they have different areas of expertise. But the White House was very important in terms of leading this as well. The NEC and the Space Council in the first Trump administration was extremely active in pushing forward the kind of items that David was talking about, thinking ahead about how to engage proactively early on to set the stage in a way that's going to be advantageous to U.S. interests. So it's a lot of work. It's kind of not glamorous, and you might look at that and say, "Oh man, that's like, that's international stuff. It's not going to impact us," but it really does have a huge impact on U.S. leadership. So hopefully there are folks looking at this and are going to be very engaged in this administration.
I think that on that light, with respect to the ITU, I think what we're finding is with so many more countries being involved in the process, I think the process is, I don't want to say breaking down, but slowing down in terms of it is easier to block than move. And changes in the rules, updating, modernization of these rules take longer, is more complicated. And I think the US needs to figure out, working with partners around the world, how to move that faster. I think, for example, looking at providing some leadership through changes in the domestic rules, I think is an area that the US can help to push change, demonstrate the viability of that change technically in the marketplace, and drive that change at the ITU rather than looking at a ITU first. Let's get the world on board, everybody singing Kumbaya before we move one step forward. I think that is one of the ways the US can continue to demonstrate leadership.
I guess one, final question about the international landscape. So would you all think that China is the number one space competitor, or are there, Europe, what are the things globally that the US should be thinking about?
Competition is going to come from a variety of places. We don't have to say it's Europe or China. China is, of course, going to be there. They have a strong industry, strong investment, strong government support. Europe is looking at doing lots of things and innovating themselves. I think the lesson we have to take from this is we may be ahead at the moment, but unless we continue to invest, unless we continue to create an environment for growth and innovation and competition, we're not going to always stay ahead. We win when we compete. We don't win by picking a national champion like some other countries do out there. And that innovation is what sets us apart, but really provides our competitive advantage more so than anything else. And we need to continue to protect that, support that.
I would agree with that point. I think it's also really interesting to see the significant growing interest from policymakers all over the world, right, in this area, in direct-to-device, in the EU and the UK, there are continued consultations around this. And so I think that signifies that countries around the world, see this area as also a critical area of interest and area that they want to get engaged on and lead on as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would just add, I think Calpac said it, just to kind of expand on it a little bit. I mean, you got 2 different models for investment and innovation in the world. You have kind of free market model, which is, we're a pretty good example of how that works. A lot of competitors come into the marketplace. Some of them fail, many of them fail. Some of them do well, and some things work, some things don't work. And then you have more state-sponsored investment. And, I think China is kind of more on that end of the scale. So we'll see what happens with, with the 3 constellations that they're investing in. Those are going to be LEO competitors. They're going to compete with everybody, with every orbit. But it'll be interesting to see what technology they come up with and how those work. And regulators, again, what's different from terrestrial is that this is all global. I mean, every service, even though you might be just providing services to Africa, you're operating in a global environment. And that's going to be very important for us to kind of keep our arms around and understand what they're doing and what they're licensing, and internationally how that's going to work. So I think the United States needs to be vigilant, not on the international kind of regulatory regime that we talked about before, but just kind of looking at what's going on in terms of the investment in China.
Great. Well, I think that's a really nice way to wrap up our discussion. Thank you all so much for coming on and talking about policy priorities, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more from you this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
This was great. Thank you so much.
You.
Hey, everybody.